Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for this timely conversation about this year's historic elections around the world and the implications of these global elections on the future of global democracy. My name is Stephanie Talton. I'm a proud Hopkins alumna and co-chair of the JHU Alumni in Government, Academia, Law, and Policy Professional Network. I'm excited to join you today to host and moderate this joint program of the SNF Agora Institute and Hopkins at Home. If you're not familiar, the SNF Agora is an academic and public forum at Johns Hopkins University that is dedicated to improving and expanding civic engagement and informed, inclusive dialogue as the cornerstone of global democracy. We are proud to have two of the SNF Agora's visiting fellows with us today, Sanjay Ruparelia and David Smolansky. Sanjay is an associate professor of politics and public administration and is the inaugural Jaroslavsky Democracy Chair at Toronto Metropolitan University and a senior fellow of the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. He is a co-chair of the Participedia Network, which examines democratic innovations around the world on the editorial boards of Indian Politics and Policy, Pacific Affairs, and the Oxford Encyclopedia of Asian Politics, and a country expert for VDEM, Varieties of Democracy. He also hosts a monthly lecture and podcast series called On the Front Lines of Democracy. David Smolansky served as mayor of El Latio City in Caracas, Venezuela. His tenure as mayor gained national and international recognition for its transparency and notable reduction in kidnappings, despite operating in one of the world's most violent capitals. His commitment to addressing human rights violations and the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Venezuela led him to play a pivotal role in the nonviolent protest against Maduro's dictatorship. As a result of defending democratic values while serving in local government, he faced arbitrary arrest warrants, removal from his mayoral role, illegal disqualification for public service, banned from voting, and ultimately forced into exile. Currently, David is Deputy Director of the Foreign Affairs Office of the Venezuelan opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado. He led the diaspora movement in 77 cities across the world to vote in the primary election of the opposition in 2023. Before I turn the mic over to today's experts, I'd like to remind those of you tuning in live to please use the chat feature below to leave comments and ask questions. We'll be monitoring the conversation and we'll do our best to respond to as many questions as we can during the Q&A towards the end of this broadcast. And now, without further ado, I'm thrilled to turn it over to Sanjay Ruparelia.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, and thanks to the SNF Agora Institute for organizing this. It's a real privilege to be here, and especially with David Smolansky, and given all the courageous work that he has done in his home country. I'm going to speak about India. This is the year of elections, as we all know. More people voting in this year than ever before. And this is one of the big critical elections that happened this year. And it led with a surprise. So I'm just going to walk us through this to see what are the big patterns that we saw and what the implications might be. There we go. So this election in 2024 followed a decade in office of Prime Minister Narendra Modi. He's a leader of the Hindu nationalist BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party. They came to power in 2014. It was the first parliamentary majority, single-party parliamentary majority government in India since 1984. From 1989 to 2014, India had a series of coalition governments, the largest and most diverse in the world. And so this was a really signal change for people who use these terms and follow elections. It was considered a new party system. A new dominant party had come to power. Mr. Modi is a very complex figure, and there are many things to be said, but what's been most striking about this period of rule in India is his personal dominance in India. And these two images sort of capture some of it. One is he's a classic populist. He really has been able to corral a lot of support in the populace at large. The BJP won in 2019 in the last election, 37% of the vote. And a lot of surveys suggest that one of the major reasons people vote for the BJP in the last decade is because of Mr. Modi himself. So, you know, the party in a sense is following his coattails. The image below that you see was a very pivotal, controversial moment in January 2024, the consecration of a new Ram temple in the city of Ayodhya, where a previous Muslim mosque, the Babri Masjid, had been destroyed by Hindu nationalists in 1992. This was a long-held desire of the Hindu nationalists movement to create a temple to the Hindu god Ram, who is revered in India by many on this site. But it was a controversial, long drawn-out process. And in some ways, this image below, which broke all kinds of precedents. Most importantly, in a funny way, the prime minister himself was consecrating the temple. It was a main person as opposed to Hindu priests. Was in some ways the unofficial start to the election. The election hadn't been called yet in January 2024, but many people saw this as a beginning of this election campaign. What was the campaign about? Mr. Modi came to power a decade ago saying that he was going to transform and modernize the Indian economy, particularly through manufacturing jobs, the expansion of infrastructure, and to really create good jobs for millions of youth that are entering the labor force every year. In a sort of classic populist style, you see the image on the left. He also sort of guaranteed a whole series of promises about social and economic benefits. And what we did see in this election, and the survey graph on the right that you see right on my screen, is that economic matters were really important to a lot of Indian voters, like in many countries we've seen in the world: cost of living, inflation. Are there good job prospects? Do people have secure jobs? There's been a great expansion of welfare benefits in India over the last 2 decades, taken a different form under Mr. Modi's government. But there was a real concern about employment and jobs. I want to kind of highlight that as a concern that might cross beyond India's boundaries. The election itself was very controversial in this sense. Over the last decade, a lot of scholars, commentators, journalists have noticed in India and many other countries in the world, of course, a process of backsliding, the erosion of norms, institutions, and practices we normally associate with good democratic governance. And I'm going to focus on just one, given that's a very short presentation, and we're focused on elections. There was a sense in which the electoral playing field in India had been tilted to the advantage of the governing party. And this was done in sort of, I'll just highlight 2 ways. One are rather controversial campaign finance laws, or a mechanism about funding called electoral bonds, which was introduced just before the last election. It made the donation of money to political parties anonymous from corporations, but it allowed the State Bank of India, which was a recipient of these funds, to know who the donors were. And so the image on the right shows you that the lion's share of campaign finance by corporations to parties went to the BJP. I mean, an astronomically much greater share than other parties. So there was a sense in which that was tilting the playing field. The second is there's been a lot of there's been a crackdown, of course, on dissent in civil society in India over the last decade in many quarters, but there's also been a hounding of the political opposition. And the image up on the upper left-hand corner is just before the election began in March 2024. I should have mentioned it's 44 days over 7 phases, the longest election and the largest election in the world. A very popular chief minister in the state of Delhi, the national capital, Arvind Kejriwal, was jailed on what many in the opposition and some of the media saw as sort of at least controversial, if not trumped up charges that he was corrupt in some way. And so there was a sense in which, this wasn't going to be an entirely free and fair election. And many commentators have argued that since independence, this is probably the most contested election in terms of, to the extent that whether it was free and fair. The opposition put together an opposition alliance led by Rahul Gandhi, the scion of the Congress Party, and that's his image there on the bottom left corner. And as you can see from that tagline, the opposition had a deeper lineup. More parties were there, but the BJP had been very powerful in the last decade in vanquishing opposition parties in the states. What did we see in this election? We saw very high turnout. The last 2 elections in India have been the highest since independence, roughly 67% nationally. In some states, that turnout rises to 75 and 80%. So it's very striking. This is a highly energized democracy in terms of electoral participation. But we also saw, as we've seen in many other democracies, the use of social media in quite divisive ways to fuel polarization and even hate speech. There have been a lot of studies of this. Many parties are involved, but most researchers who've been studying this saying that the BJP itself was the main culprit for spreading hate speech, if not the BJP party itself, but certainly those who are supporting it in the wider ecosystem. And the Election Commission of India, which for many years was considered a gold standard election commission in the world, came under a lot of scrutiny because under the model code of conduct, it should have stepped in when there were speeches that were seen as controversial and violating that code. So for instance, mobilizing voters on religious grounds or showing enmity to particular communities, not least by the Prime Minister himself in some controversial speeches. The Election Commission should have come in to censure the party, but it didn't. And so it really came under a lot of scrutiny and criticism. And just before I get to the final result, what was very striking is polls since January of 2024 and right up until the day before the election verdict was announced showed that the BJP was going to come back for a third term. It was going to win another parliamentary majority. In fact, it should sweep the opposition. And one of the main mottos of the campaign for the BJP, I'll translate it into English, was this time 400 seats. There are 542 seats in the Indian parliament. You need 272 to be a majority government. The BJP had 303 seats in the last parliament. They now wanted 400, which would give them the power to change the constitution. And that alarmed many because it still has a Hindu nationalist ideology. India has a secular constitution. There have been a number of laws and practices and incidents in the last decade which have chipped away or challenged that secular constitution. And this was a great concern. But on the day before the verdict was announced, it looked like it was going to be a sweep. The NDA is the BJP's governing alliance, and you can see it's far beyond 272. But what happened? The BJP lost 63 seats. One person, one of India's best political thinkers, Yogendra Yadav, it's worth mentioning his name, courageously said, even when those exit polls were shared on the day before the verdict, that they were wrong. He'd been touring the country, particularly in the Hindi heartland, where the BJP is very strong. And he said the sentiment on the ground amongst voters about cost of living, inflation, the high-handedness of the BJP in dealing with certain opposition figures, the fear that the constitution might be changed and would harm minority groups and their interests was palpable in those northern states. And so the BJP actually lost its parliamentary majority. It lost 63 seats. The opposition alliance won over 230. The BJP has come back to power, but now as a coalition government. It's the first time Prime Minister Modi has ever had to share power with anyone. He's always been a presidential figure in his, even though it's a prime ministerial system, he very much acts as a presidential figure, even when he was a chief minister of the state of Gujarat in the earlier part of his career. So for the first time, he's had to share power with these new opposition, not opposition parties, but coalition allies within the broader alliance. So I'll end there and simply say we're at this another kind of turning point. The BJP is still the lead party. It's still what's called a system-defining party. Most parties are either for or against the BJP in terms of alliances. The most important ministries in the government still are in the hands of the BJP, so it's still the dominant party. But for the first time, it's received a setback, and most importantly, it didn't expect it. So it was a political defeat, and some people say also a personal defeat for the prime minister. And so this next parliament, which is governing for 5 years, is going to be greater contestation, greater challenge of the government. I'm going to have to wait and see how it plays out. But let me stop there and turn it over to David.
Thank you so much, Sanjay. It's always a pleasure to be with you in a conference like we had a couple of weeks ago. And thank you so much, John Hopkins, for organizing this conversation. Well, in my case, I'm going to speak about the elections that we had in Venezuela. Maybe a very important difference from to understand in the case of Venezuela regarding other elections that happened across the world this year is that our election was held under a brutal dictatorship, and we used this election as a strategy a non-violent strategy, a peaceful strategy, but very firm and brave strategy to define and challenge the regime. So I have to put a little bit on context because that election happened on July 28th. What happened before? So this strategy started in 2023. The opposition in Venezuela was divided, was fragmented, and it was criticized for not being united and being more articulated to challenge the regime. So we decided to go to a primary last year that for many, it was a risky strategy because many people thought that that primary won't be able to happen, it won't happen, or if it happens, it will be weak on participation. But it was the best option that we had to unify the opposition and to legitimize our election. So after 9 months, because we had 10 months actually, because this started in January of 2023, we were able to have a primary. It happened in October 22nd, almost a year ago, and with and against every odd and under a huge social control system that the regime has developed and repression apparatus, we had 2.6 million people that went to vote and elected Maria Corina Machado, which I have the honor to work with. She was the turnout was 93%, and the most important result that we had is the participation and also that it was organized by an independent commission with members from civil society, specifically members from different universities. So that really took by surprise the regime. The regime was a kind of like a comfort zone, saying we have everything controlled. You know, the opposition is fragmented. 8 million people have fled Venezuela, I have to say, largest migration and refugee crisis right now, even above Syria and Ukraine. So the regime was kind of overconfident that that would be a failure, and it happened all the opposite. So the first chapter, we accomplished. Then the second chapter, which is the election, and we will be part of that will be the discussion today. So the election happened on July 28th. So from October 2023 until July 28th, we have 9 months. And what happened? Well, the regime being the regime. So Maria Corina Machado, who was elected overwhelmingly, was illegally banned from running. Her case, that arbitrary decision has been taken to the Human Rights Council of the United Nations, to the United Nations fact-finding mission, to the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights. But even though all those important international organizations made statements about that, the regime did not allow her to run because the Supreme Court is totally controlled by Nicolas Maduro. So we started to think out of the box and how we could, prepare a smart strategy. So Maria Corina Machado, in March of this year, proposed a candidate, a very well-respected professor of philosophy that had her same name, Corina. So it was easy to see in the ballot to vote for her. She became a rock star in a matter of hours. And just let me put this in context. We're talking in a country that every TV station and every radio station, I'm not exaggerating, is controlled by the regime or is co-opted by the regime through a business community that are aligned in the media with the ideology and the policies that the regime promote. So what we have is social media and WhatsApp, which is very powerful from the diaspora. And that is how that professor went viral. Just to give you an anecdote, the most famous reggaeton singer maybe now, a woman, Karol G, from Colombia, she had a concert in Venezuela. And the professor Corina Lloris was more trending topic on X than this famous singer. So that also tells you the desire of change that people have, the desire of living in democracy. The regime illegally banned this professor for running. So we had to solve, and then a former diplomat, his name is Edmundo González Urrutia, was allowed to run. That happened for many, people were surprised, but the regime also was, trying to deal this with the international community, because there has been some rounds of negotiations with the international community, for example, that lifting sanctions in exchange of having elections. So the regime say, okay, we're going to allow Edmundo González Urrutia, sanctions were lifted, and there were some exchange of political prisoners, well, not political prisoners, US citizens that were illegally detained in Venezuela, with some Venezuelans, members of the regime that were convicted in the US, so they exchanged that. We went to the election. This diplomat Edmundo González Urrutia also went viral, social media again, WhatsApp from outside to inside. We go to the July 29 election, the most least and unfair elections that you can imagine, at least in the history of Latin America and the Caribbean. I will not, I'm not going that far globally, because I'm not an expert in elections globally, but definitely in Latin America and the Caribbean, and I'm pretty sure that if you compare with other elections in the world, Venezuela is on the most least and unfair elections that you can imagine. 120 members of our team were illegally detained. 6 of them were forced to be in an asylum seeking situation on the Argentine embassy. Maria Corina Machado, who still is the Democratic opposition leader and who was running, was banned for taking a domestic flight. Any place that she or Edmundo González went to eat, those places were shut down by the regime. Imagine that, having a breakfast during a rally was shut down. Small places, small business, to have an arepa, our national dish, for example, something shut down. But we were, we needed to get to July 28th. We got to July 28th. Oh, by the way, also an atrocity. Out of the 4.5 million Venezuelans overseas, out of the 8 million could vote. We were illegally banned for voting. My case, I couldn't vote. I've been in exile for 7 years. And with all of that, we got to July 28th. We had the election, and we won 70-30. But why do I say these numbers 70-30? Because we were able to collect the tally, the voting records. So when you go in Venezuela, the election is electronically. You push for your candidate, then you have a paper, they print a paper, the machine, you put it in the box, and at the end of the elections, those boxes you open and are counted. So then you have the tallies that the poll watchers keep. We were able to keep those voting records. We were able to transport those voting records to hiding places that the regime didn't know, where we put Starlink connection with scanners. We scanned all those voting records, and 83% of those voting records were published by us, that everyone in the world saw it. And even the Carter Center and the UN panel of experts, were the only 2 international organizations allowed to go to the elections, said that the results given by the controlled electoral council by the regime were not true. The elections lack of integrity and transparency, and many governments and well-respected members of the academia said Edmundo González won the election. Actually, the Associated Press, New York Times, and Washington Post made their units of investigation made a report on it, saying that Edmundo González Urrutia won. So the second chapter accomplished. Now we're on the third. I'm gonna end here. Sorry if I talk a bit longer. The regime has not conceded. We won in a landslide. If these were a free and fair elections, we would have won not 70-30. We would have won 90-10. That's the reality. Just imagine if 4.5 million people overseas that fled because of this dictatorship would have voted. I mean, 90-10. So they're using forces, security forces, non-state armed groups, to keep power by force, with peaceful and non-violent protests, and they have illegally detained more than 2,000 people, including more than 200 women, more than 120 teenagers. 27 people have been killed, 100 have been forced to flee. But we are in that chapter to put the most pressure that we can, with not only with what we're doing in Venezuela, but also with the international community, the International Criminal Court, to have the regime conceding and to start a democratic transition, which is the lesson from us for us on July 28th, that when you have a dictatorship, a brutal dictatorship, it's always a dilemma if you go or not go to an election, because they organize election. If you don't go, they stay, and if you go, they're going to say you legitimate them. But we use that as a powerful tool to mobilize millions, and then to expose Maduro with that organization that we have with almost 1 million people, to show that we had the voting records and demonstrate that they lost. So we are on that, and hopefully we can start a democratic transition soon, because that will benefit Venezuelans, and also it will benefit the whole region. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much to both David and Sanjay for that really, really interesting description of those two separate countries. Different, but some similarities. And I hope everyone who's been listening could also see, like I did, about some of the some characteristics or some things that we're seeing here in the US and our upcoming election with what these other countries have seen as well in their election process. So I'm going to start with some questions that I have as part of this conversation, but also please welcome to anyone who's also listening along to put your questions in the chat. And as I mentioned in the beginning, we'll be transitioning over to some questions from the audience as well through here. So I'm going to ask, I guess, Sanjay, I'll go first with you, and then I'm going to ask David kind of a similar question, but kind of going off of what I was just saying. You know, what lessons can be learned from what we've seen in India recently? So as you stated, the results aren't what the Modi government expected, but yet it kind of appears that they've pivoted, right? And they've moved to build this coalition government and kind of a power sharing agreement within India. So what does that mean, and what can other democracies learn from that?
That's a really important question. I think the most striking thing about it was David said that the election of Venezuela was the most unfair in Latin America in its history. Most experts of India's democracy think that this 2024 election was the most unfair in its history. And yet, as I said, the ruling party lost 63 seats. And to the credit of the incumbent party and the prime minister, there was no attempt to discredit the verdict. There was no attempt to say, we don't believe this because somehow something was false in the voting or the counting and so on. So I think that, I mean, when we think about the United States today, and we think about, you know, the big issue in the room, which is, will the verdict be respected? So there's sort of been two issues, right? One is it a free and fair election, both for voters and for all candidates, right? Can they contest freely and fairly? That's a big issue. And there are two different issues there: the electoral participation, and those candidates, the political opposition, or all politicians. The second then is on the in the governance of the election. In the literature we have on democratic backsliding, that's what's unusual and new about what's happened in the last 10 years or so, is that you can still steal an election. Like Venezuela in that way is a stolen election, right? In the sense that, well, they basically said that they didn't tell what the proper result was. But what often happens in many countries that have been suffering an erosion and a backsliding of the democracy is that on the day of the verdict itself, people will say this was the final count. But in the run-up to the election, the electoral playing field is tilted in all kinds of ways, right? In terms of campaign finance, in terms of clampdowns on the media, in terms of the ability to freedom of speech and assembly and opposition mobilization and so on. And I think that's the lesson from India, is that those things are happening in India, but it's really important that the political class, those who are contending for power, respect that verdict. And in that sense, that was a testimony to at least that fidelity to the verdict, right? And we lost this election, and now we're going to cobble together a coalition government to continue to rule. So I think that's one really important lesson, and there could be some others there too, but I think that's really important to think about with the election coming up in the United States, because we're still now seeing, you know, one side of this contest saying the last election was stolen, it's a lie, and already preparatory ground to say, if we've heard this from the Trump campaign, that if we lose this election, well, we know it might be rigged. And so there's this question of what's called electoral denialism, and that's a new force. And that's something that you really have to contend with and challenge head on.
Thank you. So, David, kind of moving to you, similar question. So, as you mentioned, there's been a lack of concession by the Maduro regime, not recognizing the results of the election. And so one of the pillars of a democracy that's always been stressed is the fact that in a successful democracy, there's a peaceful transition of power. So I guess what can you talk about, so far about kind of what lessons can other democracies learn from what's happened so far in Venezuela and hopefully what we're going to see in the future?
Yeah, well, I think I could answer that question in two ways, right? Not only this election has been the most unfair and least transparent ever in Latin America and the Caribbean, but also according to very well-respected human rights organizations, after the election, there has been the worst atrocities or electoral atrocities ever, because we are talking that after we won and we proved we won, more than 2,000 illegal detentions happened in less than 2 weeks. The regime started an operation. Its name is Knock Knock Operation, and it's knock knock because they literally go to your houses, do like this. The intel agents, ancient counterintelligence agencies, and they just kidnap you. And they do that against members of we had this structure for July 28 was beautiful. 100 million people, I'm not exaggerating, almost 100 million people were organized across the country to be poll watchers, to be volunteers, to mobilize others to vote, to provide food and beverage. We're talking a country of 90% of people living in poverty, extreme poverty, that can be 3 times a day. So we organize ourselves to have them, have everyone active with at least with a bowl of water or a small arepa or something. And many of those people have been illegally detained through that knock knock operation. The Inter-American Commission of Human Rights have said that in Venezuela, there is a state of terrorism. This is something that was not said since the Southern Cone dictatorships in Argentina and Chile. And the UN fact-finding mission has just said that the levels of repression that are in Venezuela have reached unprecedented levels. This is not small what is happening in Venezuela. And it's happened after an election. I mean, this is the most civic activity that any society can have. Go and vote. And we won. And look at the reaction. So I have always said a dictatorship could always be worse. Always could be worse, right? So that's one way to answer that question of what happened and lessons learned, right? That it could get very violent from power. And the other lesson is that, well, this brutal regime started 25 years ago. And I was speaking with Sanjay a couple of weeks ago. Venezuela was a prosperous democracy, a very prosperous democracy, a stable economy. Not only in Latin America, it was a reference across the world. We, as I said, 8 million people have fled the country now, but in the 1960s and 70s, 4 million migrants went to Venezuela to find opportunities. And in 1998, democracy was used to destroy democracy, because this started in a free and fair election with legal political parties, with no political prisoners, with independent institutions, and all of that was used to conquer power. And when you're in power, that was destroyed. So don't take democracy for granted. Don't take access to justice for granted. Don't take individual liberties for granted. That's my advice. And that democracy, Stephanie, goes beyond elections. Goes beyond elections. It is not only well, we have election and that's it. Human rights, civil rights, political rights, individual liberties. We need to understand that modern democracies have to go beyond elections.
Thank you for that. So, Sanjay, kind of turning it back over to you, wanted to talk a little bit about, the motivation for people in India to come out and vote. As you mentioned, the people knew that the voting was corrupt, and how the election was being run was corrupt. But yet there was just this large population of Indians who came out to vote. So what do you think it is? Because I think something we always see in the US here is, right, we have a very small percentage of people who actually come out and vote in our elections, right? And so what do you think it was so motivating to the people of India, despite the fact that there was concerns about the legitimacy of the electoral process, but they still felt motivated to go out there to cast their vote, even if maybe their vote wasn't going to be counted, or maybe they didn't know if they could actually trust the results that were going to be announced at the conclusion of the election.
Yeah, so maybe I misspoke. I mean, I think there's never been a case where Indian voters or election watchers have thought that the verdict itself couldn't be trusted. But in terms of the playing field, it was sort of tilting at that. I think the way I would answer this question was a step back, which is India is an outlier in the world of democracy. I mean, I think it's one of the great democratic revolutions in the world. We think of the American Revolution and the French Revolution, right, at these pivotal moments in democratic history. The Indian one was, of course, too, right? India, it's important for people to understand, when India's first election was held in 1950-51, the vast majority of the population was living in poverty. The vast majority of the population, well, actually, a majority of the population, had been uneducated, right? So, and that's why when you look at those early voting cards, there are symbols for every party, because that's how people could identify the party they wanted to have. Yet everyone was given universal franchise. I mean, no country in the history of the world, certainly not in the West, had granted universal franchise to all of its citizens, men and women, regardless of property, education, class, gender, any background. So it was always a radical experiment from the beginning. And in the last few decades, I would say starting in the late 1980s, 90s, India did something, again, which is very unusual. If you think about democracy and the idea of it, if you are more socially disadvantaged in a democracy, right, you are working class rather than middle or upper class, you are a woman rather than a man, if you're a minority of any type, gender, sexual, class, ethnic, racial, what we've seen in the West and what we've seen in most of the world is that you're less likely to vote. People are more likely to vote in the United States and in Canada, and other advanced industrialized democracies tend to be better off in some way. India overturns that wisdom. In the 1990s, people who are more socially disadvantaged were as likely, if not more likely, to vote. And another thing that happens in India, which is again very striking, if you think about the United States experience, Canada is the same, Western Europe is the same, is people are more likely to vote in elections that are closer to where they live. In other words, at the sort of municipal level or the provincial or state level, voting percentages are even higher than at the national level. So I gave a percentage of 67% for the entire country at the national election 2024. That's the highest since independence. But in state level elections, you will see people turning out at 80, 85% in some states. This is quite extraordinary. Those figures, if we ever saw them in the West, were in the sort of 50s and 60s. And since then, we've sort of seen the secular decline in electoral participation. So I'm giving all these figures to kind of give a context that India is already an outlier. And I think one of the things that's very striking is that Indian voters, precisely because there is still a lot of absolute poverty, there are great inequalities of various kinds, and they're cut across many different axes of caste, gender, religion, ethnicity, language. The one thing Indian voters prize is this power of the vote. And there have been at least two critical elections in the history of India. This might have been considered a third, although I think it's sort of two and a half. One was in 1977. India had an election after 2 years of emergency rule. It's India's only period of authoritarian rule, where the prime minister at the time, Indira Gandhi, suspended the constitution, suspended democracy, the Democratic Provisions Constitution, and ruled in an authoritarian way. She called an election to legitimize her rule, and she was thrown out, and she obeyed the verdict. She came back to power in 1980, but nonetheless, same thing happened in 2004. The last time there was a BJP coalition government, there was an expectation it would win. All the exit polls said it would win. The voters turned it out. And so one thing that's very striking about India is just some anthropologists have described, Indian elections are sort of sacred. I wish I'd had an image I could have showed. Should have showed one of the images to everyone who's listening. You know, one of the things that you'll see in Indian elections is that it's just taken very seriously. There's a very well-known anthropologist, Mukhalika Banerjee, who's written about this, about, you know, if you look at how, for instance, particularly women, when they go to vote on election day, they're dressed in their finest saris. It's a very sort of solemn, secular, sacred sort of exercise of citizenship. And so they take it very seriously. And I think in that sense, the lesson to take is that, you know, civic participation, electoral participation is something that normatively is very important. And as democracies, we have to kind of instill that. And that's something that India has done very effectively.
Thank you for that. Actually, so David, I kind of want to turn it over to you for kind of a similar type of question, right? I mean, you talked a lot about the repression of the regime and, you know, how they treated the candidates and everything like that. And yet you saw this voter turnout and people really voting for the opposition, you know, and I don't know if I want to say without fear, maybe those people did vote with fear, but we wonder if you could just talk a little bit about, you know, the motivation behind the people to kind of get out to vote, you know, despite the fear and despite the repression that they were seeing from the regime.
It's to be free. I know it could sound a rhetoric or something, but it's literally we want to be free. We want to have democracy. We don't want more people fleeing. I want to go back and see my parents are getting old and old, and I haven't seen them. And this, what I have is the same that 8 million people who have been forced to flee want. We want to be back. Some are going, we want, some of us, or many of us will be back to be part of the rebuilding. Others maybe, you know, go to visit. But you know, this movement that happened July 28th is a pursuit of life for us. It's what Sanjay was saying about the Indian revolution to conquer its independence and become a democracy. It's, for us, it's like our second independence, to be honest. This is what it's about. And you will remind what I'm saying this, what I'm going to say now, that if we achieve the democratic transition, there's a free Venezuela, you're going to see hundreds of thousands celebrating across the world. It will be the Berlin Wall of Latin America and the Caribbean when that happens, is equivalent. And that was the trigger for many to participate on July 28, despite the repression, the social control, the fear. Is to live in a country with opportunities, is to live in a country where family could get reunited, is to live in a country that you can have access to justice, is to live in a country that you can start your business and that business will not be expropriated, is in a country that you can dream of having good education. So and that goes beyond any, you know, policy making or something. It's those are like moments that happen in history, and that's what we are so committed on achieving. This is tough, but I think we will prevail. We will prevail on this strategy that, as I said, started a year ago, and we have already accomplished 2 out of the 3 chapters.
Thank you. And I have one more question right now, and then we're going to turn it over to some of the questions we've seen in the chat. But Sanjay, when you were kind of talking about Modi and kind of his growth in his position and his growth in the power and the party, you know, it kind of reminded me of, again, the US election, right? You have a leader of the party who has a very large personality, and they kind of become the entire party, and you see politicians underneath them kind of modeling themselves and their behaviors and their beliefs to kind of this larger than life kind of personality. So I wonder if you could kind of talk a little bit about that and kind of this, you know, this changes that are people voting, or, you know, are we seeing in some of these democracies that people are now voting more for a person versus a party, in terms of the leader of this party or the face of the party versus kind of what the party stands for or the party had traditionally stood for?
No, that's a great, important question. I think in many democracies in the last couple of decades, what we've seen, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, is a concentration of power. Now, concentration of power can take various forms. What's very striking, and I think we live in this sort of populist moment, is that there's a personalization of power. The idea that I, the leader, stand above my party and I represent the people. That's why I showed that first image of all those voters who sort of see themselves in Narendra Modi. I should have mentioned, it's very important, he comes from a very modest social background, a plebeian background, a lower caste in India. So in that sense, his rise is seen, and in some ways it very much is, compared to the dynastic leadership of the Congress Party, which was crucial to India's establishment as a democracy. Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first prime minister, was a sort of impeccable constitutionalist, right? But in a sense, this is the social churning in a democracy that, is there somebody who's part of the common people who can rise to being the ultimate leader? So in that sense, I think it's important to see that Modi represents it, but he goes further then. He says, I embody the people, I embody the people's will. And I think that's something that we've seen in many democracies. You could think of, well, there's various types. There's sort of a left populism and there's a right-wing populism. Modi's very much a right-wing populist. The idea that, well, how do we define the people? We define the people in quite narrow ethno-national terms, in this case, a Hindu majority. That India, although it's a secular democracy, for Hindu nationalists, is fundamentally a Hindu nation. That's what they want to create, a Hindu nation. Hindus make up almost 80% of the population, but there are lots of cleavages within the Hindu community, and there's many, and so I think there's that. When it comes to the comparison to the United States, it's really striking. Prime Minister Modi, of course, sits in a Westminster parliamentary democracy, but he acts very presidential. You have a presidential system in the United States, or presidential systems in Latin America. Again, that's what's distinctive about the Americas. I think what is different is that, at least from what I can see from the United States, is there has been resentment within the BJP party as the concentration of power has occurred in the prime minister's hands over the last decade. There was a lot of fear to openly oppose the prime minister because he's very popular, but there's a lot of disgruntlement, and particularly in the Hindu nationalist ecosystem, the most important organization is something called the RSS, which is the parent body of Hindu nationalism. They were actually, there's a lot of tension and friction with the prime minister because he upended the power sharing codes in that movement. I think that's something that, at least from what I read in reporting, and I don't study American politics as closely as India, the Republican Party and what's happened under Trump has been quite different, right? That they've walked, at least enough of the party has walked lockstep with him to question, the 2020 election, to say, and that's happening even now. And I think that's where you do sort of see a difference, in a sense that there was a growing internal rebellion in some way within the BJP, and certainly within the wider movement. And I think that's a distinction to kind of keep track of in the United States, what's happening. And then we can see that with, I'll just finish with this, with the Harris campaign, trying to reach out to Republicans saying, look, you may not vote Democrat, you may not want a Democrat as president, but you can't endorse somebody who's saying that the verdict, if I lose, has been rigged.
Great, thank you so much. So we're gonna turn over to a few questions that we've gotten from the audience. So the first question I'd like to throw out there for both David and Sanjay was, Barbara asked a question about what impact do social media like Facebook or Twitter have on elections worldwide, especially in terms of disinformation and polarization?
Well, if I may, to start on this, it play both ways. In the case of the regime, they have developed a huge social media apparatus on disinformation that has external support from China, kind of Russia as well. Turkey used to play a role as well there, and they create fake news, etc. But also, it's important that they have their official accounts where they create fear. On that knock operation was so striking when they posted it officially with a horrific music from terror movies, that we were able to then take those down because we contact some social media companies saying, how on earth are you are allowing this, right? In our case, from the democratic movement, we have also used social media to defeat censorship of self-censorship, not only with people within Venezuela, but also, as I said earlier, it is so powerful having 8 million people abroad texting on WhatsApp. This is not, I'm not exaggerating that sometimes people in Venezuela know first something that happens in the country from a WhatsApp message from a relative overseas that what you can listen or read or watch in Venezuela. And that's powerful. And Maduro has been so nervous that since July 28th, he has prohibited the use of WhatsApp to the armed forces. And the armed forces, and there are frictions because some soldiers are saying, no, I'm not going to stop this because this is the best way that I have to speak with my family, with my friends. I mean, this is the only thing that I have to text, because not only for us, social media, obviously X and Instagram and others, but WhatsApp has been very, very powerful.
Yeah, let me just add quickly. In the last decade, there's been a growing scrutiny and suppression of media freedom in India, particularly in television stations, been bought by conglomerates that are close to the ruling party, and then silence and censor more critical voices. There's also been this party in particular has been extremely adept at using social media and digital communication very, very effectively. I mean, Prime Minister Modi is an expert communicator using social media on Twitter, or now X, through a monthly radio program and so on. So this last election was actually christened the WhatsApp election in India. But an interesting thing happened, which is different from what David described, but similar in one way and different. Because the official legacy media, the mainstream media, many sections of it have been sort of captured or really through censorship or self-censorship. There have also been lots of new laws and rules that sort of penalize, anything that the government might see as too critical. What you did begin to see were very important digital platforms in India. I'll mention just a few that some people may know if they're following India: The Wire, Scroll.in, News Laundry. So digital platforms became places where more critical investigative journalism could flourish. And in this election in particular, some journalists who left voluntarily or were pushed out of their jobs in mainstream legacy media took to YouTube in particular to sort of say, well, here's what's really going on. And so there's a battle in social media, and in an odd way, because more and more people began to distrust a lot of the main channels, because they seem to be just sort of towing the government line, these more critical voices could use social media to say, look, reality is a bit different. In fact, it's quite different, and here's how you should be thinking about it. And so in that sense, a space that was really captured and dominated by the ruling party, and there has been a lot of disinformation, misinformation, and hate speech and so on, because it was also an attempt to control the mass mainstream media, there's been more contestation in that space. Thank
you. So another question we had, and David, this kind of touched a little bit about this when you referenced the military and the WhatsApp and the answer to the last question. But Dan had a question about the role of the military in the respective countries in propping up the existing regimes. Could they speak to the use of military to perpetuate the regimes, and whether there was any pushback by the military to be utilized in such a way?
Well, in the case of Venezuela, that's the elephant in the room. I mean, the main pillar right now for Maduro to keep power by force after he was overwhelmingly rejected on July 28th election is the armed forces. I think the main pillar for the regime right now is the armed forces, non-state armed groups, and external actors in this order: Cuba, which is very, very involved in Venezuela with the intel and counterintelligence agents, Russia, Iran, and China. And that's what we are facing. But Venezuela has 2,000 generals. That's more than the whole NATO. And that's how they share power. That's all the companies, all the business, everything that have been expropriated for 2 decades have been given to those generals. Some of those generals are governors, or mayors, or part of the Maduro's cabinet, or are involved in illicit activities such as mining and drug trafficking, which, according to international transparency, represent 21% of the economy of Venezuela, Imagine that, even that we have the largest oil reserve of the world. But if the armed forces becomes institutional, and I'm not thinking on the generals, I'm thinking on the low and middle rank officials that are suffering like many Venezuelans, and they have relatives who have fled the country, and there are many soldiers and police who have fled the country. So if they are able to become institutional, which is obey the Constitution, respect what the majority said on July 28th, and facilitate a transition, I think we have a chance to restart a democracy in my country. But it is sensitive, this topic, and it is not easy because there are external actors that are literally on the military bases in Venezuela, especially working on countering and it will be, I have to be in this very, very clear. It does not a coup d'etat happens. It's an institutional movement because the people have already spoken, voting. So the armed forces need to obey what the people have said in the elections, and that's what our Constitution mandates.
So I think we have time for just one more question. Cindy had a question about what tools does the world have to deal with such blatantly fraudulent elections? I want to be hopeful that the voices of the Venezuelan people will be heard, but do things like sanctions even work? So David, that obviously is for you.
Yes. Sanctions is a tool, and I know sanctions is always a very controversial topic, but my advice is that we cannot do copy paste. Like if sanctions didn't work in this country, it will not work on this country. If it didn't work out in this nation, it won't work out on this nation. I cannot explain, really, I don't have enough words to explain. When you don't have justice in your nation, you have to go overseas. I've been in exile for 7 years. Yeah, I was illegally removed from office. I was elected mayor. And after I won, the regime did not recognize. And I was forced to flee, and I am under illegal arrest warrant. And I cannot go to any court in Venezuela. If I go, I will be right now detained in the biggest torture center of Latin America and the Caribbean, where thousands have been psychologically and physically tortured, and where right now, as we speak, there are women who are sexually abused and everything. So when you cannot access to justice in your country, you need to go for it overseas. And you have different instances. You have the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. You have the Human Rights Council. You have the UN fact-finding mission. You have the International Criminal Court. And also governments could implement sanctions, because you know what is unfair? It is unfair that those who are responsible of tortures or crimes against humanity have all that money in Bank of America, in Wells Fargo, in TD Bank in Canada, as is happening, and many other. Why? If they are committing crimes, the least thing that you can do is at least to froze those assets. They love to buy properties, not in Cuba, not in Moscow, not in Tehran. They buy it in the US, or they buy it in France, or they buy it in Spain. So the least things that you can do is to froze those assets, right? And go to and implement individual sanctions against the ones who are responsible for corruption, money laundering, human rights violation, and crimes against humanity. So I know it's sensitive, but I agree that when you don't have justice in your country, individual sanctions have to be implemented as a tool of pressure to hopefully have a real negotiation with them, or to push or to put enough pressure to have a crackdown that could help us to have a peaceful democratic transition.
Great. Thank you so much for that answer. And thank you so much for your time today, and for your presentations, and for answering all of our questions. This has really, truly been such an amazing conversation, and really, really riveting, and just so very interesting. So I really want to thank David and Sanjay for their amazing insights today. I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in to listen to our conversation. For more information about the SNF Agora Institute, please visit snfagora.jhu.edu. For more information and to register for our next Dean's Notebook featuring the Krieger School of Arts and Sciences, my alma mater at Hopkins, Dean Chris Salenza, that will be on October 10th, please visit hopkinsathome.jhu.edu. So thank you again for everyone for tuning in today. I hope you have a wonderful afternoon and a great weekend.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Stephanie.
you.
Thank you, Sanjay. Always an honor.
Yes, likewise, David.